First off, I got myself some wood and started carving out the foundation for my house because my last couple of playthroughs, there just hasn't been any caves on either side of my world. I then made a wooden spear to defend myself and noticed that I can make a wooden figurine to summon a forest guardian, so I thought, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to summon the first boss 5 minutes into the recording? So I summoned the first boss and things obviously didn't go my way. It was time for me to actually get geared up, so I began exploring to the left in search of a cave, but surprise, surprise, I didn't find one. The only thing I managed to get my hands on was some cacti that I used to make a cactus bow. I didn't even bother checking the right side of my world for a cave and instead just got started on the elevator. Doing this was long and tedious and boring, but I got a life crystal out of it and eventually found an actual cave system. I did a bunch of mining down here and found some new dark ore that I couldn't mine just yet, but eventually I returned to the surface to smelt all the ores I was able to mine and made a gold spear and a gold pickaxe. I then headed back down the elevator and spent the next hour getting down to business. I mined an absurd amount of ore, found more than just a handful of chests, and completely maxed out my health. I had climbing claws, I had a band of regeneration, I had Hermes booze, I had a cloud in a bottle, I had shoe spikes, and to top it all off, I now had full gold armor. I'm not even trying to skip all the boring stuff that happens at the beginning of every Terraria playthrough. I legitimately got all of this done within an hour. It was actually ridiculous. To celebrate, I made a bunch of NPC housing, but in probably the worst way I could have imagined. I don't know what possessed me to make them in the shape of a V, but hey, at least it's interesting. After I finished, I began to explore the right of my world in hopes of finding a crimson close to spawn, and thankfully, my wish was granted. I made a slimy crown to summon the King Slime and built an arena for the Brain of Cthulhu since I was already there. I then returned home and picked a fight with the Guardian of the Forest. Yeah, that fight was pretty lackluster, but at least the projectiles he shot were really cool. He dropped 3 weapons, a forest dagger, a storm staff, and nature's wrath. The dagger was, well, just a dagger. Nature's wrath summoned these really pretty leaf-like projectiles, and the storm staff looked and behaved exactly like the emerald staff, but dealt less damage. I summoned the King Slime to test everything out and concluded that the storm staff was the best of the bunch, but thanks to my very little mana, I had to take him out with my spear. Honestly, all of these weapons kinda just sucked, so I went home and made the CL-47 to see if that would be better, but I forgot that guns need ammo, so scratch that idea. I figured that I should probably just use the storm staff for now, so I spent all night long running back and forth gathering up fallen stars to turn into mana crystals. Once the sun rose, the arms dealer moved in and I was able to buy over 1,000 bullets to test this thing out, and what better way to do so than by fighting a boss. I messed around until night fell and then defeated the Eye of Cthulhu, and this gun, despite it dealing a whopping 4 damage, is probably even better than the musket or close to it at least. As good as it is, I replaced it as soon as I got home with the AKA, a slightly stronger, more automatic gun that seemed to show much more promise than my CL-47. I also made a star flower, and this weapon not only dealt quite a bit of damage, but was also really pretty. When morning had come around, I noticed that all of the rooms I had built for the NPCs to move into were already full, so I spent the entire day making 12 more. At this point, I felt pretty ready to take on another boss, so I headed over to the Tundra to gather up some ice, went back home to make a cryo crystal, and then headed back to the Tundra to deal with the Cryo Guardian. This thing really made me feel like all of my weapons did little to no damage whatsoever. I felt unbelievably weak fighting this guy. I mean, it had 4,000 health. It just took me so long to beat. It dropped the Spear of the Cryo Guardian and a nice flower. The flower was pretty mid, and the spear dealt almost double the damage of my gold one, so I was pretty happy. I took my new gear to the Crimson to test it out against the Brain of Cthulhu, and the Spear of the Cryo Guardian did not disappoint. The ice flower sucked though. When I returned home, I made full Crimson armor and a Deathbringer pickaxe. I then hopped down the elevator to see if the new pickaxe could mine the dark ore that I found earlier, and it could. Funny enough, the stuff is actually called dark ore, and since I could mine it now, I went back to all of the deposits that I had found earlier to gather it all up. Once I had more than enough dark ore, I returned home, smelted it all into dark bars, and made a dark sword and the Merc. The sword fired a quick wave projectile, and the Merc fired a burst of 3 skulls. I deemed both of these weapons better than the ones I was currently using, so I equipped them both and headed over to the underground desert to get some antlion mandibles to make the summon for the next boss. Now that I had the summon, I headed back over to the desert to take on the primordial worm, but the boss is broken. Every time I summoned it, it would emerge from the ground as if it were going to attack me, but then it would just keep going until it despawned. After a couple of tries, I noticed that my new sword dealt quite a bit of damage to this guy thanks to it being made in segments, and I figured that if I drank the right potions and timed things perfectly, I could take it out. So I returned home to buy a Wrath potion and a Rage potion so that my damage and crit chance would go up by 10%. I then headed back to the desert to give this thing one last go, and I actually pulled it off. I was able to take down all 6,250 of its health in an instant. The only issue is that this boss dropped nothing. Like, when it died, it just disappeared, and I got nothing at all. After that huge waste of time, I figured I could make up for it by defeating the Skeletron, so I headed over to the dungeon, set up a super small little platform, and took him out. I dove into the dungeon right away and gathered up a bunch of bones to make a new armor set. Once I thought I had enough, I returned home only to be surprised with a goblin army that I would have to take care of, but it wasn't too bad since this dark sword I had dealt so much damage. I then made a diamond amulet that increases my magic damage by 8%, crit chance by 4, attack speed by 4%, mana by 20, and it reduced my mana cost by 4%. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I totally forgot about making that new armor set with the bones and instead just continued the elevator until I finished it and then dove into some lava to mine some Hellstone. I didn't even make anything out of the Hellstone right away. I kind of just went back and forth between hell and the surface because I felt like I was forgetting something. Eventually, I remembered what to do and made the Acolyte's armor set. It's a mage armor that improves pretty much every magic related stat you can think of. I then got to crafting with the Hellstone. First, I made an Armor Gem core, which increases pretty much every stat by a little bit. I then made a Book of True Fireballs, a Fire Spear, a Suspicious Magma Eye that's used to summon the next boss, and a Magma Cannon. The spear seemed pretty cool but too close range. The book was very pretty but too inaccurate, and the cannon dealt a lot of damage, but the projectile it shot like falls off really quickly. In the end, I knew that these weapons were going to be better than what I was currently using, so I replaced them all. There were 2 other weapons I wanted to make before fighting the next boss, the Full Moon Spear and the Flower of the Night. Both of these weapons work kind of like the Knight's Edge, where you just combine 4 other weapons to make it, but I won't bore you with all of those details. Just know that I ran around to the jungle, dungeon, and hell to make them. The Full Moon Spear was really cool, but all of these spears are way too close range for me. I just don't like it. The Flower of the Night wasn't any better. I mean, it was just one straight beam that did nothing special. Regardless, I used both of them to help me make the Hell Highway, but in the end, it was the Magma Cannon that was the best. It was now time to fight the next boss, but I kept on losing due to my stubbornness. I really wanted these new weapons to work out, but as soon as I whipped out the Magma Cannon, it was over for the Guardian of Hell. That fight didn't look very hard, but I was actually struggling with this one. It dropped 3 weapons, a magma sword, a hellstone bow, and the staff of the infernal necromancer. The sword looked like it could be pretty good, the bow didn't, and honestly neither did the staff, it just looked like a worse version of the magma cannon. All I had left to do now was wait for a guide voodoo demon to spawn so that I could fight the wall of flesh, so I went down to hell and began my long wait. The wait wasn't actually that long this time around, I got it relatively quickly and then defeated the wall of flesh with ease. It dropped all of its usual stuff, but it also dropped a bunch of this slush of fate stuff that's used to make some pretty cool looking weapons. I only had enough to make the Staff of Fate, and it honestly seemed pretty bad. I went back to hell and fought the Wall of Flesh again to get more slush, and used it to make the Sword of Fate and the Chakram of Fate, and both of them seemed much better than the Staff. I then headed over to the Crimson to break some altars and test out these new weapons, and it turns out that the Chakram of Fate was the best. I mean, it was actually one-hitting some of the Wraiths. Afterwards, I got to mining some of the hard mode ores, but while doing so, I was attacked by some huge worms. They're called Flanric worms, and they aren't too difficult to kill at all, but it was quite the startle. The worms dropped Flanric crystals and scarlet fragments that are used to make lots of really cool gear, but most of it can't be made till after the mech bosses and some other gear even later. There was still some stuff I could make with it right now, so I headed to a big open area underground and got to farming. I did this for a while, but eventually I had enough Flanric crystals and scarlet fragments to make a Flanric rose. It's a magic weapon that shoots a flower, which after a while scatters into homing petals. After I made it, a blood moon just so happened to rise, so I spent the entire night playing around with my new weapon, and it was wonderful. There were some guys that also dropped Flanric crystals and scarlet fragments during this event, so that was cool. When the sun rose, I had no time to rest, as the pirate army thought it would be a good day to invade. Once they were dealt with, I went and got some Souls of Flight and Souls of Night so that I could make some Flanric wings, and they were pretty fast. I then finished gathering up the last of the hard mode ores and farmed for some more Flanric crystals and scarlet fragments. During this time, I was attacked by a Crimson Mimic and got the Bow of Arrows for killing it. When I returned home, I used some of the scarlet fragments to make a magic weapon called Killer Doll that dealt almost 100 damage and fired very quickly. I chose to test this new stuff out of the twins with like 2 minutes left in the night for whatever reason, and the Bow of Arrows showed some promise due to its homing arrows, but the Killer Doll was quite awful. I was still going to need a lot of scarlet fragments for future crafting, so I headed back down underground to get some more, and this Bow of Arrows is significantly better when used in on normal enemies. After I got bored, I returned home and noticed that I could make a new weapon called Ice Jack, so I made it, and it seemed like it could be pretty good for my fight against the destroyers. So later that night, I summoned the boss and totally forgot to use it. I used the Bow of Arrows for the entire fight. Anyways, I used the Souls of Might that I got to make an old Atom bow. It does significantly less damage than my current bow, but it fires like an assault rifle, especially after I reforged it. I was considering switching my class from Mage to Ranger based on all these new cool Ranger weapons I was getting, so I went down to Hell and farmed the Wall of Flesh a couple of times to try getting a Ranger emblem, but I had no luck. Night had already fallen again, so I whipped out the Void Clap that I made a while ago and summoned the Void. This guy was unbelievably easy. I think it's because the weapons in this spot are just way too unbalanced. Like in the beginning the weapons sucked, and now I'm way too overpowered. I really hope things start to balance out towards the end. The Void dropped a Void Blaster that I didn't even bother trying to use after I saw this. Just before night ended, I managed to defeat the Skeletron Prime as well, and during this fight I noticed that my Flanric Rose was actually way better than my Atom Bow. Maybe it was just this boss, but that showed me everything I needed to just stay as a mage. Oh, I also got a Book of the Void from the Void, and chose to test this thing out on the twins the next night, but it was so bad. I now had all the souls I needed to make a bunch of new weapons. I made the Rage of Fire, the Luminous Hymn, and the True Full Moon Spear. They all looked super good to me, so I tested them out against the Destroyer and found a clear winner. I also made a Black Grimoire, and this one was just scary, but after using it underground, I realized that the true power is fear. I went underground in the first place to find a new ore called Electric Ore, and thankfully this stuff was everywhere. After mining just under 500 electric ore, I returned home and made the Power Armor set. It increases all of my mage stats like usual, but the set bonus made some weapon called Railgun Gauss deal an extra 25% damage and get an additional 20% attack speed. This weapon apparently dealt almost 500 damage and was super easy to make, so I made it, but it honestly didn't seem like all that. I then made the Book of the Lightning Ball, a high frequency sword, an electro bow, the Pulse Blaster version 84, and the Cutter Staff. All of them sucked. All of them sucked, except for the railgun, but that's only because it deals almost 500 damage. Oh, and I also kept the cutter staff around because why not have a couple of summons? I get rid of the summons right away anyways, they do like no damage and they're kind of just annoying to have around me. Once my loadout was decided, I headed over to the jungle and got to work on a Plantera arena, but after just 5 minutes of building, I got bored, so I just summoned and defeated the boss. With the Plantera out of the way, I was able to grab some ectoplasm from the dungeon and make the Terra Flower. It's a magic weapon that, honestly, it sucked. I don't know why it did. It's a Terra Flower. I don't know, it sucked. There was a lot of other new gear for me to make, but all of it required scarlet fragments, and each thing needed so many of them, like almost hundreds of them. So I just farmed the Destroyer for like 500 of them. I then used them to make a history book and the freeze mark, and tested them both against the Golem, but it was clear as day as to which one was better. I was gonna go fight the Lunatic Cultist right away, but I had one more boss to take out first, so I made an asphalt platform and took out Epsilon. I didn't even see how the boss died, it kind of just dropped dead. It wasn't hard anyways, so it's whatever. Epsilon dropped a heavenly bow, a heavenly sword, and a heavenly staff, and as cool as they all looked, they all sucked in comparison to my history book. Afterwards, I made my way over the dungeon to fight the Lunatic Cultist, and it just wasn't fair, not in the slightest. Now that I had an Ancient Manipulator, I made the Blood Maze and the Spectral Killer. They both seemed like they were really good, but again, literally nothing could beat my history book. Despite this, I was in denial, so I still used the Spectral Killer to take out the Nebula Pillar and the Vortex Pillar. I made a couple of other weapons while taking out the rest of the pillars, but my history book still proved itself to be superior. As a last-ditch effort, I spent like 45 minutes gathering up ectoplasm, getting a couple of broken hero swords, and defeating the Pumpkin to make a sword called the Reaper. I even made a fire gauntlet and switched over to the melee version of my armor just to see if this weapon would be better. After all of that preparation, I made my way over to the Stardust Pillar, and oh my god, I had finally found a weapon that was better. I quickly finished up the last 2 pillars and took out the Moonlord without ever dipping under half of my health. There was only one boss left for me to take care of, but before that, I had one more arsenal upgrade to do. I made myself some crystal wings and began my final fight with Armagem. I'm so glad the final fight turned out this way. It wasn't too easy to where I could beat it on my first try, and it wasn't too hard to where it would take me hours to beat. Armagem dropped 3 weapons, the Unconquered, the Vanquisher, and the Grimoire of Another Dimension. I'll be very blunt and say these weapons just weren't it, man. They just weren't that good, but it's okay because the boss dropped 2 souls of pure power, and they're used to make the real endgame weapons. I tested out all 3 of them, but the obvious winner was the Scarlet Devil. And that's it. That's the mod. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe if you've made it this far because only like 10% of you guys actually are, and I'll see you all soon.